said, we're going to continue our series this week. And what we're doing a series that's called Dreamer. And we're looking at the life of Joseph from the story of Genesis. Actually, throughout the course of this year, we've been able to preach on the entire book of Genesis. Genesis is one of my favorite books of the Bible. I am an Old Testament person, if you know me well. And I love the book of Genesis. And I've really enjoyed this series on the life of Joseph. Now, as we've looked at the life of Joseph, we've been specifically focused on the dreams and the passions and the desires that God has placed inside of you. Right? We believe that when God created you, I think that in the church world, because there are desires that are probably not the best for us, they get a bad rap. And I think that a lot of people in church world have almost demonized dreaming and imagining and passion and desire when really God created those things inside of us. Right? God did not create you to be a lifeless robot. God created you to dream and create with Him. In fact, in Psalms chapter 139, it says, "For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are my works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth." See, we were not made by accident. God doesn't make junk, right? God didn't create you and was like, "Oh, I didn't mean for that to happen." No, God made you with specifically to serve Him in a specific capacity, right? Like you have dreams, you have passions, whether that's entrepreneurship, maybe you're great at administration, man, maybe you love loving on people, you're an encouraging person, maybe you have the gift of mouth, you like to talk, and sometimes it's hard to get you to stop talking. Whatever it is, like some of you have different giftings, right? And not all of you's gifting is my gifting. Some of you, the concept of being up on a stage scares you more than death itself. That's not me, right? I'd be terrified not being on the stage. I don't like not being heard. That's probably a sin issue and a desire issue. See, there's a balance. That's a whole nother message. God can use your desires, the enemy can too, right? That's a whole nother sermon. We'll get there. That's a whole nother message. But as we get older, so God created us with things that He wants to use for His glory. But as we get older, I find that we stop dreaming with God. I find that we stop being passionate about things. I find that we stop living life and we start existing. And we're just going through the motions. We're just taking our kids to practice. We're just doing our 9 to 5. We're just making sure that all of our bills are paid and that our ends are met. Don't you think God created us for more than that? Don't you think that God created you to do something more than that? In fact, I think that God created every single person with a passion and with a purpose, and we can only find our purpose and our life when we start dreaming with Him and when we start using our passions and desires for Him. And so what we've talked about in this series is 4 things that are going to keep us from living our dreams. The first thing we talked about was the voice of others and how some of you have listened to what someone else said and it kept you from pursuing what God had for you. Last week, we talked about temptation and how a lot of us, even if we're good at resisting the voice of others, we start listening to the voice of the enemy and he gets us to compromise and he gets us to lose our integrity, and God can't use someone for His purpose who lacks integrity. So even if we got the dream, even if we pursued the dream, if we didn't take God with us, then it was all pointless, right? And we left off last week with Joseph going where? He was headed to prison, right? In fact, he was accused of something that he did not do. He was accused of trying to sleep with Potiphar's wife when really she had been trying to sleep with him. And Potiphar gets so angry that he takes Joseph and he takes him and he throws him into prison. In fact, let's look at that verse one more time. It was Genesis chapter 39. And if you have your Bibles, you can turn with me to Genesis 39. We'll be primarily in 39 and 40 today. And in Genesis chapter 39, verse 20, it says this. It says, "And Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison." The third thing that keeps us back from our dream and what I want to talk to you about today, I want to talk to you about defeat. In fact, you can title this message, because I know that you love taking notes, you can title this message, "The Prison of Defeat." This message is going to be one of the more personal ones for me today. And you know, with Joseph, as his life is picking up, as his life is beginning to look better, even as a slave, he was finding success, and he was put over his entire master's house, right? Like, he was put over everything. There was no one as powerful in Potiphar's house as Joseph other than Potiphar himself. And just as things are looking up, everything is ripped out from under him, and all of a sudden he ends up from being the most powerful slave to being thrown and locked away in a prison. There's not like a lot more defeat that you can get than where Joseph is right now. Right? He's been sold by his brothers, and then he's been betrayed by his master's wife, and he's in prison. So he's living in this defeat. And maybe you're in here, and I think my first reaction is like, well, Joseph didn't do anything wrong, right? Joseph did the right thing. So why is Joseph living in defeat when he did nothing wrong? He should be able to keep his head up, right? But I find in my life the times that I have been most defeated are not based off what I've done in my actions, but the season I find myself in. I find that circumstances dictate the way I feel about myself more than even how I am living, right? Like, seasons dictate how I feel, whether I'm doing right or wrong. Most of us get defeated by our circumstances. And the crazy thing is, you can't control your seasons, right? I can't, I've never, no matter how hard I've tried, I've never been able to control a season. I can't, for instance, this is going to drive me crazy this morning. I can't stop you guys from celebrating Christmas early. I've tried. I've really tried. You guys act like Thanksgiving isn't even a thing. I'm in here getting ready with my turkeys, and I'm ready to deep fry it, and I'm so excited, and I'm getting prepared, and you guys are out here listening to like holiday Christmas music, and I can't stop that, right? I can't stop you from wearing Christmas sweaters. I can't stop you from decorating and putting up your tree, God forbid, early. As hard as I've tried, I cannot convince Walmart to put out their holiday section the day that Halloween is over. It's just not going to happen. People are celebrating Christmas like Thanksgiving is not a thing. But despite how hard I've tried it, I just can't. But the problem is I get so angry and frustrated with people that I can't control. And we have a lot of people who in seasons of life, they are trying to control and they are trying to stop what they were never meant to control. And they're getting frustrated and they're getting angry and they're feeling defeated because they're trying to stop something that they have no control over. And they are basing their worth and they are basing their emotions off of the season and off of the circumstance that they are living in. And they can't control it, so they can't control how they feel. If your emotions are based off of your season and your circumstance, then guess what? Your emotions will be a roller coaster. And you will live in just being tossed back and forth between, hey, you know what? I'm feeling good today because things are going well. Right? Like when spring's here, you'll be hopeful. When summer's there, you're going to feel like you're killing it. But what happens when winter comes? And a lot of us, we aren't prepared to be successful in the middle of winter. How do you respond to a prison season? A season that most people would see as defeat. And you know, for me, I'll be honest, it can be little circumstances, right? I'm going through one of the best seasons of my life, right? I have a new son. I've just gone full-time into ministry for the first time in my ministry career. Just launched a church. On the outside, I'm winning the game, right? Like, I love the season of life that I am in. But can I be honest, this is probably the most personal message for me out of all of the Dreamer series. Because I don't care what you say about me, right? Voice of others doesn't affect me. You can talk all you want. I love it. I live for the comments, right? I love reading the comments. It's great. You can say whatever you want. It's not going to deter me. And temptation, whereas temptation is there, I don't want to sit here. I'd really regret, challenging the enemy and saying that I don't struggle with temptation. Everybody struggles with temptation. But temptation's not where the enemy gets me as much as despair, as much as defeat. Because I can be killing the game in every area, but you know what? The enemy's going to whisper in my ear the one person that didn't respond. He's going to whisper in my ear the one line that I tripped over. He's going to whisper in my ear just everything that I didn't do right or how I wasn't prepared. The enemy, what he's going to tell me, it's even worse for me if I'm in a good season, because the enemy tells me, he's like, well, what? You should be doing more. Right? Like, you're in the best season of your life and this is all you can accomplish. And I'll find that I live in the prison of defeat because my circumstance, and despite my circumstance, but one thing goes wrong throughout my day, and all of a sudden, I am defeating myself. This is a personal message for me. I was speaking this with my wife last night. She doesn't get to hear me on Sunday mornings because she's back there killing the kids' game. But as I was with my wife last night and I was going over my message, she was like, "Are you preaching to yourself right now?" Because I can avoid voice of others, I can be strong against temptation, but I can still feel like I'm living in defeat inside and outside of my seasons. And so what I want to talk about today, I want you, because it's really easy for Joseph to have been there, but I want you to look at verse 23. It says, "The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, listen, whatever he did, the Lord made it successful." In the middle of a season where most people would define it as defeat, right? Like, nobody's looking at Joseph right now and be like, man, Joseph has the life, Joseph has the dream. But in the middle of this, Joseph is not only surviving, he's succeeding. And so the question today is, how can we succeed in prison? Because if you can succeed in prison, man, it doesn't matter where you are at or what season you find yourself in, you can have success in that season. Right? You can have victory in that season. You don't have to live in defeat. Like, if you can be strong up here, then whatever season comes your way, you can be strong in that season. So the question today is, how can we be successful in prison? And what I want to do, I want to look at 4 ways that Joseph finds success in prison. Number 1, you have to be able to define your success. Define what success looks like for you. See, Joseph was successful. Verse 23 said, "The Lord made Joseph successful in everything he did." Now, it can be easy to miss it because in the Bible, the unusual is pretty common, right? But it's not normal to think of a prison sentence as successful. I've been to a lot of job fairs in my life. An inmate is not usually one of the booths, right? And there may be people in here and prison was part of your physical story, right? Like, God's not done with you. God's not done redeeming that. Like, last thing I said, God's used people in prison all throughout Scripture. Like, that's not my point here. I'm just saying that a lot of people, and if you were in prison, you probably weren't feeling very successful in that season, right? Nobody's looking at Joseph and thinking, oh man, he's killing the game. We wouldn't say that, but you know what does say that? The Word of God. See, we need to understand that God's definition of success might be a little bit different than yours. God's definition of success may be different than yours. So my question is, how do you define success? How do you know that you're successful? How do you define it? And you need to know, because if your definition of success doesn't line up with God's plan for your life, then you're going to feel like a failure in any season that doesn't look like what you want. And like I said, you can't control your season. So if your definition of success is based off things you can't control, then your life, your view of your life will be based off the season that you're living in. And Joseph can't control the fact that he's in prison, but he still finds a way to be successful in adversity. Joseph wasn't focused on what happened to him because he couldn't change it. Here's what you can control in any season. You can control who you are in the midst of that season. That's it. That's all. I can't control the fact that my son is getting older. I can't control if people respond to God. I can't control the fact that I just entered into my last year of my 20s. I cannot control these things, right? And as much as if I try to control these things, then guess what? I'm going to end up failing. You know what I can control? I can control how I walk through the season of life that God has put me in. And if you define what success looks like for you based off your circumstance or based by things around you, then you'll never be successful because it will change. But if you define it based off something internal, then guess what? You can find success no matter what season that you're in. And so here's what I'm going to do. I said this would be a personal message. This is something I've been working on for years, actually. I have 5 definitions of success. These are things that these are my personal, if you want to know how I measure up my life, these 5 things are how I measure up my life. If I'm doing these 5 things, I feel like I'm living successful. If I'm not doing these 5 things, I feel like I'm failing. And, well, in my right headspace. I'll say that because I'm not perfect. Like I said, this message is personal for me. Number 1, God's presence in my life is produced from my time with Him, not my response to my circumstance. Basically, that means is that I find that God is in my life. It's not based off of how busy I am. It's not based on what trial I'm going through. It's not based on what I'm struggling with. It's not based on maybe how well I'm doing in life. The presence of God in my life is based off my quiet time. That's it. Because the Bible tells me that if I seek Him with my whole heart, I will find Him. So I don't make excuses. If I'm not experiencing God, it's because of me. It's not because of Him. I believe in desert seasons, but Jesus was still communicating with God in the desert. Right? So wherever, no matter what season I'm in, whether it's I'm in the prison, the palace, Potiphar's house, whether I'm, a stuck-up brat in my father's house, in any season, I can have the presence of the Lord living in my life. So that's number 1. That's how I define my success, is God's presence and is God's voice in my life. Number 2, those around me see God in me. That whatever, like God's presence in my life, it's now affecting everything around me. Number 3, those closest to me love and respect me the most. See, I get a lot of praise and recognition, being on the platform, but it doesn't matter anything if my wife and my son think I'm a monster behind closed doors. Right? Like, I think we live a lot for the Instagram highlight reel. What are people seeing on the outside of me? But what does my wife see? What does my son see? The people that are closest to me, they love me and respect me more than the people who I'm doing life with from a distance. Number 4, I invest in people more than things. That's important to me. I think church culture can become about investing in structures and buildings and everything but people. My job is to invest in people and let the buildings, let the structures, all that stuff's important, but that's secondary. Number 5, this one's personal. I work the hardest when people are not looking. I like to be known as a hard worker, but sometimes I like to put that on display. What do I do at 1 a.m. and my sermon's not finished and I have to finish it on a Wednesday night? Do I compromise on my setting? Do I compromise on what I'm doing? Or do I work the hardest when no one's around to see? So those are my 5. That's how I measure my success. God's presence within me, those closest to me. Am I investing in people? Like each week, am I working hard by myself each week? Those are my measures of success. Now, you can steal those. You can use those exact ones for all I care. You can adapt those. You can crumple those up and throw those out and define it success for yourself. But what I'm saying is that you need to know, man, how do I leave that up for a few minutes, Sam? Because, I talked really fast. So give people a chance to write it down if they want. But you need to know how you define success. Because if you do not know, okay, this is what success looks like for me, then guess what? You will never be successful because you will base your success off of what other people around you tell you that success is like. I don't want to live my life based on another person's definition of who I should be or what I should be doing or what makes me successful. I want to know what I believe that God has called me to something specific. And this may seem super unspiritual to you, But at the end of the day, read my list of success. It's based off God's presence and then the people around me being affected by that. And I think a lot of us, we start finding success in our jobs, in our workplaces, in the things that are material, in our positions, rather than the people that God has placed in our life, because we don't have it defined in what it really looks like to be successful. And so we get distracted by what everybody else is telling us this is what success looks like. And so we live in this defeat mentality because we can't control it. And so there'll be times where we're on top of the world and we're killing the game. And God's made us in the world, and we've been successful in the eyes of the world. Man, but what happens when something doesn't go our way? Man, what happens when you feel like there's something missing? And all of a sudden we fall back into defeat. What happens when we enter into the prison? Do you know what success looks like for you, or are you being tossed back and forth by the seasons of life? See, there's not peace if we don't have definition of what success is. I love Psalm chapter 1. If you ever are here in the morning and you hear me doing my mic test, for the past 2 months, I think that every morning I've done a mic test quoting Psalm chapter 1. It's a great psalm. It's the first one. So it's just, anytime I want to read the book of Psalms, the first thing I read. It says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is upon the law of the Lord. And on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree that is planted by streams of water." And listen, that yields its fruit in its season. And his leaves do not wither. In everything he does, he prospers. See, this is straight from the Word of God. I feel like sometimes the old school religious person in me is like, man, this Dreamer series, it feels a little fluffy. But this is straight from the Word of God, that if we are focused on Him, that if we define our success based off God and rather than ourself and our circumstance and our surrounding, then guess what? In everything we do, we will prosper. I mean, that's what Psalm chapter 1 says. And you know what I love about Psalm chapter 1? It says that in its season, it will produce fruit. What does that mean? Is that there are seasons that it's not producing fruit, but its leaves are still not withering, and it's still successful in all that it does. Right? Like, notice the difference. It's not producing fruit in every season. And a lot of us base our success off our fruit. Right? A lot of us base our success on what we produce. But here's what it's saying. It's saying that even when it's not producing, its leaves are still strong. It's not diving into despair. It's not diving into defeat. And because of that, everything that he does prospers. But why? Let's go ahead and move on to number 2. It says that because his focus, because his life, he is planted by streams of water, and the streams of water is the law of the Lord, and on that law he meditates day and night, which is the second thing that we see from Joseph. Joseph not only has a different definition of success, Joseph also focuses on God. Verse 21, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, listen, the Lord made successful." You know, the best way to not live defeated is to be focused on the one that's won it all, to be focused on God. Because a lot of times we get focused more on the prison than what God's trying to do there. And you know, for me personally, I become more aware of what I'm trying to do for God than what God is doing for me. And this is another measure of success that I try to bring to the table that just doesn't work. Because I try to define my success in what I am doing for God. Now, I want you to notice my definitions of success, they were very much like effort-based, and they were very much focusing on God-based. But a lot of times, I try to make myself worthy of the Lord based off the fruit that I bring him. That's my temptation with God. I want to bring God something that makes me worth his time. But you know what the funny thing about that? That's crazy, right? Because I've never deserved God's love. And if you base your worth, if you base your success, if you base the presence of God in your life based off, hey, you know what? I'm going to do something for God so that I deserve him, then you will always feel like a failure because you're trying to succeed in an area that you were never meant to. Like our problem with God, like the problem with God's presence in your life is not the fact that you're in prison. It's the fact that maybe you are trying to earn God's love. You were never meant to earn God's love. You were meant to accept it. Right? Like God's love, it was always here for Joseph in the middle of the prison. The question was not, is it there? The question was not even, does he deserve it? The question is, will he accept it? Because look at Joseph. Where's Joseph at? He's in the middle of the prison of man. But what is he experiencing? He's experiencing the steadfast love in the Lord. Your problem is not that the steadfast love of the Lord is not there. It's that you may not be aware of it. What is keeping you from being aware of the Lord in the season that you're in? I find a lot of us make excuses. Well, I'm just too busy. I just have too much going on. I guarantee you that you can probably wake up at 4 a.m. and make time for the Lord. That's crazy. I can't do that. I stay up too late. I'm just saying, do you want it enough? Do you want God enough to be aware of him in your prison? Do you want God enough? And maybe some of you, we'll talk to the palace next week. Maybe it's a palace. You need to be aware of God in the prison if you want to carry him into the palace. Because some of you, the enemy's distracted with success rather than defeat. Are you aware of God in your prison? Because I guarantee you this, God has not left you there. In fact, I find that a lot of us find God most in a prison season. Because a prison season strips away everything, and sometimes defeat makes us desperate enough to turn to the Lord. God might prefer you in prison because you can't handle the palace. You can't handle success. And so God's had you in a prison season because you haven't been working on yourself. You haven't become more aware of him in the season that you're in. Look, become aware of the Lord in the season you're in, and you can take him into any season that you go into. Don't stop waiting for something to change for you to have a better relationship with God. Well, I'll start serving at church when? Well, I'll start going to prayer night, hello, tomorrow. I'll start coming to prayer night when? I'll start doing this when? I'll start spending time with the Lord when I have time or when my kids are out of the house or when this happens. You will always find excuses for not spending time with the Lord. Always. It will always be there. There will always be an excuse because the enemy doesn't want you to be aware of the Lord in your prison. He wants you to be imprisoned spiritually, emotionally, physically. The enemy wants you to live in that prison, and so he's just going to keep throwing distraction, and we just eat off it. We thrive off it. We thrive off distraction. We thrive off sleep. We just need one more hour. That's what's most healthy for us. Listen, don't make excuses for your time with God. Carve out whatever you have to carve out to get before the Lord. Are you aware of God in your prison? That's maybe the most important thing that I could get in this entire series, this sermon, in the entire series. Are you aware of God in the middle of your season? Because if you're not, guess what? Your success, you could base your success off things that aren't ultimately satisfying. Moving forward, you can use your dreams for others and not point them to Jesus. If you don't get that cornerstone right, that God, the steadfast love of the Lord, his mercies are new every morning, even if I'm in prison or slavery, wherever I'm at, the steadfast of the Lord, love of the Lord is there. If we don't start there, then we miss everything else. Number 3, use your dreams or your passions for others. So Joseph, he's here in prison, and what ends up happening over time is Pharaoh's baker and cupbearer, they're thrown into prison with him. And it says this in verse 5, it says, "And one night, when both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each who were in the prison, each his own dream. They both dreamed, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, listen, he saw that they were troubled. He saw that they were troubled. Anyway, I want to make sure you underline that. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." You know what the greatest way for me to get out of a season of defeat is? To be engaged in a mission. See, it's hard for me to live in defeat when I have purpose in my life. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it's perfect, because I'll go home and beat myself up about my mission. But whenever I'm more focused on how God wants to use me to reach someone else than I am myself, see, when I start beating myself up, it's when I become more focused on myself, right? Like, why didn't they respond to what I had to say? Why didn't they do that? Why aren't they loving me? See, when I'm more focused on myself, I begin to feel defeated. But when I'm focused on what God is doing in someone else's life, I feel purpose, I feel mission. I'm like, you know what? I want to reach someone. I guarantee you there are people around you that you can reach. I don't care who you are. If you are sitting in this room and you're breathing and you have a pulse, if you don't have a pulse right now, call a doctor. But if otherwise, if you are in this room, there is someone that you can reach. Period. God didn't place you on this earth to just be self-focused. And a lot of us live in defeat because we know we should be living for more. I want you to notice 3 things about Joseph here. Number 1, Joseph was aware of the fact they're in trouble. Like I said, Joseph saw that they were troubled. Now, this is important because we live in an unaware world. We live in a world, I said it week 1, where we just post everything on Instagram. We want people to see what we're eating. We want people to see us. We want to treat ourselves. We want to be focused on ourselves. We are self-focused. You know, when I'm counseling people, I hear a lot of people saying, you know what, they're just not what I need. Or they're just not meeting my needs. Or they're just not doing this for me. Now, I want to be careful here because I'm never an advocate of abuse. Like, there are just some relationships that you should not be in. But I find that a lot of people confuse abuse and annoyance, right? Like, a lot of people are just annoyed they're not being abused. A lot of people, they're just not maybe being treated fair. They're not being abused. And I want to be careful here because I don't want to speak to like a teenager that doesn't know the difference between abuse and loving like Jesus. Right? I do want to be careful here because there's a line. And I think that the line's pretty clear, but I don't want to be here being like, hey, lay yourself down, your feelings don't matter, and then someone just be like, okay, well, I just got to trudge through this. I have a responsibility. But at the end of the day, I find that a lot of people care so much about what they need, they're so unfocused on what the people around them need. And we have a tendency to look for people to be to us what we are unwilling to be for them. I find that we're scared to care for others, to really care for others, because we don't want to be in a position where we care for someone more than they care for us. And it has ruined people's relationships. It's ruined people's lives, because here's the deal. Paul says, I want to outdo everyone else in my zeal for the Lord and my love for his people. And I find a lot of people that want to reserve themselves, who want to hold themselves back, because guess what? Vulnerability and loving someone more than yourself, it's going to cause pain. It is going to cause hurt. And I find that we're so scared of being vulnerable that we live our lives isolated even within the church. And we're not aware, and we're just looking for people to be to us what we want before we'll be to them what we're looking for. Nobody's willing to start it. Nobody's willing to say, you know what, I'm going to love like Jesus. Even if they don't love me, even if they crucify me, I'm going to love them like Jesus has loved me. And all the same while we talk about accepting Jesus' love when we're the ones that nailed him to that cross. Are you aware of the trouble that the people around you are in? So often we want to be seen that we are unwilling to see. And the problem is, if Joseph hadn't been willing to see the trouble here, no one would have helped him out of his trouble. And maybe you are still in trouble because you've never seen anyone else's trouble. You are so focused on your own that you don't see anyone else. But not only does Joseph see, look at the second thing. These are like subpoints, by the way, for using your dream to meet other people's needs. And that's what Joseph does next. Joseph meets the need. Not only does he see the need, he meets the need. He presses them, right? He goes on and he says, why are you troubled? I think we fall into this thing. I'm the worst at this, by the way, so I'm calling myself out, where we get the I'm okay, right? And we just accept it. We're just like, okay, they're okay. Thank God. I don't have to spend 20 minutes talking to them. Because here's the thing. Helping someone that's troubled, I'm not saying that it doesn't take time, and I'm not saying that it's not uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable, and it takes time. You have to blow past the I'm okays. Like, you know what I'm talking about when someone you're like, hey, how you doing, buddy? I'm okay. Everybody knows you're not okay, right? And they know that you know. Like, they're seeking help, all right? They're seeking I'm not okay. Their demeanor, their body language, everything is screaming, I'm not okay. And they want someone to care enough to push through. And if you're like me, if you're an Enneagram 8, you're like, well, why don't they just say something? Like, shut up, stop moping. I get it, trust me. My tendency, can I just be vulnerable? If you don't like a vulnerable pastor, go find somewhere where they're not vulnerable. My tendency would be to be like, okay, that's fine. Like, you're okay. I'm going to go and do my own thing. That's my tendency. I don't want to sit here and nurture and coddle and come on, tell me what's wrong. I know you're not okay. That's not my tendency. But you know what? That was kind of the tendency of Jesus. So if I want to be like Jesus, maybe the problem is not them, maybe the problem is me. Because Jesus saw the need and he met the need. Like, Jesus took time for the sinful woman at the well, right? Jesus took time for the one woman that was broken and in the crowd, and she touched the hem of his robe. He was on his way to go heal someone from dying, and some people would say that that's more important, but Jesus took time in the middle of what he was doing to look at the woman and say, you know what, your faith has made you well. Jesus took time in the midst of mourning John the Baptist, his cousin. He took time to feed 20,000 people. That's who Jesus is. And so often we get caught up in doing what we're doing that we forget that we're called to be Jesus to the people that are troubled and broken and hurting. You know, Jesus tells a story about this. One of the most famous stories in the Bible, in Luke chapter 10, he tells a story, and I'm going to kind of modify it to our cultural understanding. He tells a story of a man who is besieged by a band of robbers. They rob him, they beat him up, they throw him on the side of the road. He's there, he's seemingly dying. He can't move for a good bit of time. And as he's laying there, a pastor comes by. They didn't have pastors back then, but he was a priest. A pastor comes by, and the man begs for help. You know what, the pastor? He doesn't have time. He'd love to, but he's got a sermon to preach, right? He's got people to minister to. He's got to get to church. He's got an event going on. He's got a prayer night. He's got a Thanksgiving outreach. He's got whatever it is. And what he does is he goes and he says, you know what, I don't have time. He gets on the other side of the road and he passes him by. And he leaves the man sitting there crying out for the pastor to help. Hours pass and there's a Christian. Someone that bears the name of God. And as they're walking by, the man cries out and he asks for help. But it's not that the Christian doesn't want to, right? They just don't have time. They got to get the kids to soccer practice, right? They got to cook. They got to go buy a turkey before Sela Church goes and buys all the turkeys and sends Walmart into a turkey spiral where nobody can get turkeys in Hickory. It's not that they don't want to, they just don't have time. I'd love to help. God bless you. And keep walking down the road. But then what happens? There's someone that does not bear the name of God. They call them Samaritans. They were not Jewish. They were not God's people. Be like if an unbeliever, someone that didn't believe in God, came walking by. the man asks for help. And not only does this unbeliever help him, he goes above and beyond to make sure that he blesses this man in every way. And I'm so terrified that this is the point that our churches are in, where we are not meeting needs and the world is starting to see it, and they're starting to bring in people and adopt people and love people and outdo the church in showing love, because we are so caught up in our church functions, our church culture. We want to build up church people. We want to do life that look like us, smell like us, dress like us, act like us, and we want to do everything with people who are us, and we are unwilling to meet the needs of troubled people who look different. And they may be weird. They may smell funny. I don't know. They may be awkward. You may not connect with them. You may not be able to make small talk with them and talk about the Cowboys and whatever it is. I'm not denying that. But do you love them enough to be Jesus to them? Because I guarantee you that Jesus don't connect and vibe with everything you do. And yet he still died on the cross for you. Some of you need to pick up your cross and remember what it means to love someone else. Because not only is Joseph aware he meets a need, and not only does he meet the need, the third thing, he gives God glory. He simply says that the dreams belong to the world. See, when someone's in trouble, it's a great opportunity to tell them about who our God is. Because just like prison makes us desperate, just like defeat makes us desperate for the Lord, maybe their trouble makes them desperate for the Lord. And I think that a lot of us were scared to sound too Christianese, and we don't want to, step on any toes, and we don't want to do this. Listen, they need the Jesus that you have. And if your fear is like, oh man, I just don't want to impose, maybe you haven't been transformed by the gospel enough to be so in love with Jesus to where it's just natural for you to say, hey, look, I've been there, and here's what happened to me. Joseph is aware, he meets the need, and he talks about God. And I love what God does, because what he does is when Joseph does this, God provides the skill to interpret the dream. See, Joseph didn't get the interpretation of the dream until he was willing to step out in faith and say, you know what, I'm going to meet the need, I'm going to see the need, and I'm going to show you who God is. And because of that, God shows up in the prison, and he reaches the cupbearer, he reaches the baker, and they get to see God in action. And you would think this would kind of be the transitional moment for Joseph, but in fact it's not. Because what happens is that these two get restored back to Pharaoh. And what's supposed to happen? Well, the baker gets his head chopped off, so not really him. But the cupbearer is supposed to tell Pharaoh that Joseph could interpret dreams, and that Joseph was this awesome guy. He was the head of the prison. He had been imprisoned wrongfully. The cupbearer is supposed to tell the Pharaoh all of this. But he forgets. He forgets Joseph. And I think a lot of us, Joseph enters into this waiting period for 2 years. 2 years. Joseph enters into this waiting period. I think a lot of us, this waiting period is where we grow bitter. Because we begin to ask, why are we here? Where is God at? Like, I know I dreamed at one point. Why is that not happening? And I find that the hardest point of this whole process, the hardest point is the fourth and final way to be successful in prison, and it's to wait for God. Joseph waits. It says in chapter 41, verse 1, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. Behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed. In the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep, and he dreamed again. And behold, there were 7 ears of grain that were plump and good, and they were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning, listen, his spirit was troubled. And he sent and he called for the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. Thank you for remembering 2 years later. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and he put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. There was a young Hebrew who was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard, and when we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me, but God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So what happened? Pharaoh's going to go ahead. He's going to tell him his dreams. We're going to not read the whole thing. It's a long passage. He tells him the dreams. Joseph does. God gives him the ability to interpret the dream. But what I love is that Joseph is the same here that he was in prison. And I want to encourage some people that are in the waiting today. Because I think a lot of times when we're in the waiting, it feels hopeless, it feels useless. It's like, God, I'm wasting time. The waiting season is never wasted time, it's preparing time. Like we see the prison season, we see the waiting season as waste. But that's not what God's trying to do. And maybe it's taking you a long time to get out of your prison season because God is trying to do things in the waiting that you're just not allowing him to do. See, God uses the waiting to produce in you what he's going to use in the palace, what he's going to use your dream to do. And a lot of times we're in this waiting season and we don't allow for God to work in us what he's going to do inside of us. See, Joseph here, what does he do? He sees that Pharaoh is troubled, and he begins to interpret his dream. It's using the same language because Joseph was able to because Joseph was able to see the trouble of the cupbearer and the baker. He was able to help Pharaoh in his trouble. But if he had never taken the time to work his gifting and work his heart in the middle of prison, then God could have never used him here to be the man that speaks into Pharaoh's life. And so maybe you're in prison or maybe you're in the waiting and you're like, God, what are you doing? I promise you, God is trying to build something in you right now. Waiting is not passive, waiting is active. Look at Joseph. I love verse 16. He says, Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. If you were there for our first story, remember Joseph did not, when Joseph got his dream, he didn't even mention the Lord. Never said God. God's not mentioned in the first story that we read, Genesis 37. That little punk kid that was prideful and wearing his coat and all jacked up and like, man, you're going to bow to me. Never brought God into it. Here he is telling Pharaoh with his dream, it's all God. God's going to give you that interpretation. And where did he learn that? He learned that in prison. Telling the baker and the cupbearer, this is who God is, and he's going to interpret your dream. I'm going to step out on faith that God is going to interpret your dream. Tell me your dream, and I've got it. Or rather, God's got it. He gives all the credit to God. He gives all the credit to the Lord. See, Joseph is the same in the palace that he was in the prison, and because of that, God can use him. Your waiting season, it is not just you sitting there. It's not you sitting back on the couch waiting for God. God is waiting for you to respond to what he's trying to do in this season. What is God trying to do in this season? Are you going to sit there and you're going to be like, you know what, I don't know, I'm just going to try to go through the motions, I'm going to try to figure it out? Or are you going to start asking the Lord, what are you trying to do with me in this season? And if you go on to read the rest of chapter 41, you're going to see that God, he not only gives Joseph the insight, but he gives him wisdom, and Pharaoh puts him over the whole kingdom. He becomes the second most powerful man in basically the world. It's incredible. He clothes him with new garments, which is kind of a theme for Joseph. But what I want to look at just right before we go is verse 46. It says, Joseph was 30 years old. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh. Joseph was 17 when he was sold by his brothers. I want you to put that together. We've covered this in 3 weeks. That's 13 years. 13 years of slavery and prison, in which Joseph's sitting there like, where is God in the midst of this? How is God going to use what he gave me? Because here I am, and sure, I'm seeing God move, I'm seeing God work, but I'm in the middle of prison. I just want to encourage some people this morning that maybe you have gone through a prison season or a defeated season or a tempting season, or you've been in a pit, and it's felt like 13 years. God is still working in the waiting. He's not done with you. He was not done with Joseph. And in fact, Joseph was able to find God in the waiting. And because he found God in the waiting, God used him in the season that was to come. Are you going to sit there and are you going to just go with what success is? Are you going to live in that defeat of the season that you're in? Or are you going to realize whatever season I'm in, that I can define success according to what God, I can focus on the Lord. He can use me to build not places, not positions, but he can use me to reach people, and that's where I'm going to find life, and that's where I'm going to find abundance. And even in the waiting, I can find the Lord. Because when I wait on him, I'm never disappointed. Close your eyes with me. My challenge this morning, we've done a different response every single week of this series. And today we're not gonna do the whole raise your hand. Because I feel stirred up that everyone has lived in a defeat. That everyone has something that tries to defeat them. So my desire is for everyone to respond. And each of you can respond different, whether you stand, whether you just need to sit in that seat and worship, whether you need to come to the altar and get someone to pray over you, whatever it is, I want everyone to respond to the Lord this morning. Where you are, where you're at. How can God use you in this season? Because if you're focused on the Lord in this season, then I promise you, it won't matter if it looks like prison. It won't matter if it looks like a palace. It won't matter if it looks like a pit. It won't matter if it looks like you're still living in your basement at the age, your mom's basement at the age of 30. It won't matter if you are, a business owner at the age of 22. It does not matter. Whatever season you find yourself in, you will find the Lord. So Jesus, right now, we center our focus back on you. Our dreams are not about our dreams. We don't want to let our dreams become idols. We want to let our passions, we want to let our desires, we want you to use them because we believe that you have life and life abundantly for us. And that means that when we're focused on you, no matter what dream, no matter what season we're in the middle of, that God, that you can use us, that God, we can find you. Maybe someone in this room, they're trying to do stuff and they're in a season where they just need to sit before you. You're calling someone to get their eyes right before you before they start trying to run. Because we have to learn to sit right. We have to learn to sit before you before we can learn to walk with you. Someone's been sitting and they've been distracted and they need to start walking. They need to start moving. They've waited for too long. God, there's someone in here. And God, even when I mentioned the word defeat, they felt sick in their stomach because they look at themselves every day like a failure. God, I pray that right now that they realize that their worth is not based on what they've done, that their worth is based solely in the image that they're made in. That God, that you created them in your image and you sent your son to spill his blood for their sin. And God, who are we to hold on to the things that we've done when you do not? Who are we to cling to our unworthiness when, God, you looked at us with love? And I pray right now in whatever season that we find ourselves in, that God, that we recognize that the steadfast love of the Lord, it is never ending, it is always present, and that we can find it in the midst of our season, in the midst of our prison, in the midst of our circumstance. We pray as we respond. In your name we pray.